So some of you may or may not have attended my previous presentations where we've covered different topics around intellectual property, the basics of how does intellectual property work and what are the tools in the toolbox. And this one, we're going to try to get into a little bit more. How do you actually commercialize it? Once you have your intellectual property, what are some of the things you can do with it? So as I mentioned, thank you again to Lindsay and to WEOC for inviting me to come back and to try to dig a little bit deeper into some topics that take us through the next steps. So taking your idea to market involves a whole lot of different steps, and it's kind of overwhelming or sometimes even a bit difficult to figure out where do you start. We actually saw that as one of the questions just a few moments ago. And so trying to come up with and troubleshoot, how are you going to take your idea to the market and what skill set are you going to need? So as is the case with lots of things that seem a bit overwhelming and complicated when we think about doing them, breaking it into manageable steps can be really helpful. And doing a little bit of almost homework beforehand can be really, really helpful. Lots of successful businesses are also based on working with other people. So if you're going to maybe consider doing that, you have to define what IP you own and then decide what can other people do with it. Or are they going to bring some IP to the relationship or the collaboration as well? And so then you've got to figure out who has control over what. I kind of refer to it almost like a bit of a prenup in that, what are you bringing into the relationship? What are you going to do with the things that you may develop jointly? And then if you do break up later on or go your separate ways, what happens to that intellectual property? And so, as I mentioned, and as I'm sure you know, if you are an entrepreneur, you're wearing many different hats. So we'll take a look at some of the key skills and considerations that you might want to look into. And there will be some links and tools, and there's lots of people to help you. I know I'm based here in Atlantic Canada, but throughout Canada, there are lots of organizations like WEOC and others who can point you in the right direction. And don't be afraid to ask people you know, say, well, I'm about to do this. Where might I turn for help to do that particular thing? So in the past, I've spent almost an entire presentation on what's on this particular slide, but just in case you weren't at one of those other presentations, I will do a really quick review. If you just stop right now and look around the room where you're sitting, everything from what you're wearing on your feet, if you have socks, shoes, slippers, are you wearing yoga pants? Are you wearing pajama bottoms? Are you wearing jeans? I pretty well guaranteed nobody's wearing dress pants today, as if you might have done if you were in the office. But there is actual intellectual property related to virtually every product we use every day and day-to-day things. And depending what aspect of a product, and in some cases a service, that is being offered, there are different forms of intellectual property. I like to refer to intellectual property as a toolbox. And so you can use the different tools to protect different aspects of what's unique to your particular company, your product, the services you're offering. So the first one that every company has in some form or another is a trademark. What is your brand? Whether that's a company name, whether that's the logo that you use, you probably have a website. Most companies nowadays, when you start a business, you sell something online or you have an online presence. Maybe you signed up also for a Twitter or an Instagram account. So what name are you using so that people can find you? So trademarks is one of the most common tools that pretty well every company or entrepreneur that I work with will have. Next, we have a patent, which protects a product, a composition, a machine, a process. Usually the test I use for might you need a patent is if I buy your product or potentially your service, but usually it's linked to a product I hold in my hands, can I reverse engineer it? Can I figure out how it's made? Could I figure out how to copy it? If so, chances are good that a patent would be the right tool to prevent people from copying that. Copyright tends to be used more for literary or artistic works. If I paint a fine art picture, if I take a photograph, if I record music or a jingle, if I write a novel, but it also applies to software code. So I work a lot with people who come up with apps or software code or SaaS products, software as a service. So copyright absolutely comes into play, as it does for your website. What's the content you're putting on the website? Who wrote it? What are the illustrations? What are the photographs? Aspects of your website would definitely be protected by copyright. Industrial designs usually are used for the ornamentation or the appearance. So Lululemon, as a company, protects a lot of their designs with industrial designs. So the shape or the ornamentation, the way the seams are, where the seams are positioned on a garment can be protected. Jewelry makers, designer sunglasses, sneakers, lots of day-to-day products. It can be the grill on the front of a Jeep, the spacing of where those headlights are and those vertical slits on the front end. Those are very distinctive to that brand. And if your industrial design or the shape of something becomes recognizable, eventually down the road, you can qualify to get a specific kind of trademark to protect that longer term going forward. So the shape of a Coca-Cola bottle, the shape of a Gatorade bottle started off as industrial designs, but that later on became recognizable as that company's property and design, and were able to be transferred to a trademark. And we also have plant breeders' rights for new varieties of plants, though I haven't had a lot of my clients ask me questions about that. So one of the common issues that people have with their intellectual property is to start thinking about it too late. With patents and industrial designs, if you launch your product and it is being sold and has been for more than 1 year, you can't go back and protect it later. And so that becomes really important. I had a client consult with a boat builder who contacted me and said, we've been really successful. We have a very unique boat design that we've been selling, and now one of our competitors has copied it. And they wanted to know what could they do. Well, it turns out because they've been selling that boat and that particular design for over 2 years, they were not going to be able to use an industrial design or a patent to protect any aspect of it because it was too late. So having the discussions early on and considering things early on can be really important. And I do sympathize that, time, money are all in short supply when you're an entrepreneur and you're starting a business, or even a few years into it. The time doesn't expand just because you've got 2 years under your belt. But having a discussion with an IP professional, and later on we'll talk about who are the different people you can turn to and how can they help you. I am an IP advisor with CIPO. I have equivalents across the country. And so a chat early on with us can flag potential time-limited tools that you might want to use, and talk about how and when to use each of the tools and what how might you stagger your strategy? So it is really important to get things right, because you need to balance the cost, but as I mentioned, there's also the timing issue. And there are ways you can map it out so that it becomes doable. So it's tempting to assume that I created something and I invented something, and so therefore I own it, and end of story. But in actual fact, it can be a little bit more complicated than that. So if you're an employee, you may have something in your employee contract that says you don't own what you've created. So as an employee of the government, if I create from scratch a PowerPoint presentation related to my job, I don't actually own the copyright, because that's my job. And my employee contract says that my employer owns the IP. Years ago, I worked for a research network at a university, and my employee contract there very clearly said that any intellectual property I created while I was hired for that role belonged to the research network that I worked for. So I tweeted, I built them a website, I did photography, I did all kinds of things that had intellectual property, but I didn't actually own it. The research network did. So you need to be careful. If you as an entrepreneur hire somebody to build you a website and it's a contract, they are not your employee, or you don't have a contract, you will probably not own the IP or the copyright associated with what you've just paid for. You've paid for the service. So you need to be clear and spell things out and know what have you signed as a contract? What are the terms and conditions? If there's nothing written down, you just had a verbal agreement, or maybe you didn't even talk about IP at all. A very rough rule is, if I'm your employee, you as my employer will own the IP. If I'm a contractor, though, I will own my IP. So you need to be careful about that. And again, coming back to hiring web developers, coders, other people to help you build your business, it makes a big difference if they are employees or contractors. And when in doubt, I come back to my prenup analogy, write it down. It's a lot easier, and it solves a lot of headaches or potential headaches later on if you had a clear contract that was spelled out who was going to own what. What did I come into the relationship with? What am I providing? What happens to what we create together, or what I do for you? And then what happens later on when that contract is over? Can I go and do exactly the same thing for one of your competitors? Don't know. There's no right or wrong answer, but that it's really good to have that clear from the get-go, because otherwise, in the absence of a contract, it is the law that will decide who has the rights to what. And that just gets messy, and that's way more expensive than paying someone to help you draft a contract from the get-go and take care of it. So have those discussions. Remember, prenup. When you're all in love and it's exciting, have those difficult discussions. So once you've got an idea and a product or a service pretty well, flushed out, and you want to launch, you do need to do a little bit of due diligence and homework to double check what is your target market, and how realistic is it. Like, some people have the idea, if I've invented something, I'm going to get a patent, I've protected it, and I'm going to make millions. And great, I really hope for your sake, or for their sake, that is what's going to happen with the invention that you or someone you know has patent protected and done what they need to do to protect the IP. But there's intellectual property tools, and then there's business. And at the end of the day, you need a paying customer or client to pay for whatever it is you've invented or created. Otherwise, it's not a business opportunity. How crowded is the industry? What's your product's life cycle? How are you going to bring it, manufacture it, distribute it? There's lots of questions, and these are all business decisions. So, and again, that's a key message that I often have with clients one-on-one when I meet with them, to say, okay, well, here are the IP tools to protect what's distinctive to you. But at the end of the day, these are business decisions in terms of what's your strategy going to be. So what are your competitors doing? What have your competitors done? Have they registered trademarks? Are they patenting, or are they using trade secrets to protect what's theirs? Are the people in your industry big corporations, or are they smaller companies? What aspect or how crowded is the space? Is there room for you and your innovation? And how hard is it going to be to go ahead with this? So coming up with a business plan, doing the research and the digging, and BDC, and there are lots of economic development organizations that will help you do market research and find answers to those questions. But you need to plan for and think about how manufacturing, distributing, stocking, retailers, all sorts of things along those ideas. And those all tie into your business plan and are part of the thinking and mapping out. You've got something fabulous. Now what? Now what are you going to do to get it out the door and commercialize it and get it out there so people can buy it? I like to break down IP, and a good starting point, in a way I think of it in my head that helped make it clear. And I've even got it, look, jotted on a little piece of paper here, which is, first question I ask, is the coast clear? Or did somebody beat me to it? And that involves absolutely doing online research, but also from an intellectual property lens, because that's the area I work in. So did somebody trademark a name that's exactly what you're using or planning to use, or a logo that's really close to what you're planning to use? This is going to be a barrier to you. Or did they patent? We work in the IP system on what's called first to file, not first to invent. So doing the due diligence is important. Then you need to look at, do you meet the criteria to protect with those IP tools? So you did a search, good, looks like the coast is clear. Then, especially if you're talking about patenting or an industrial design, have you kept it a secret? Have you done the things you need to do to qualify to get your IP protection? Then once you are looking at protecting, because we've gone check, step number 2, we're good to go. Where and when are you going to protect? So you don't have to do everything all at once, because it can be overwhelming. And again, we're back to time and money. And how are you going to protect what's distinctive to you? Which of the tools are you going to use? And then keep in mind, I've mentioned, I believe before, these databases of information, they're free, they're openly accessible. So getting information about who's doing what with your competitors, we're back to this, what size business opportunity, who's doing what. Use those databases as a source of intelligence and information. So a little bit of due diligence on what we like to call ownership, or get your ships in order. What is it that you need to make sure you've got tidy? If you're a company of one and you were the only one involved in creating your IP, then that's probably pretty straightforward. But if you've been collaborating with other people, that's important to have all of that clear and figured out. So do you actually own the rights to use everything that you need to commercialize your product or the services you're going to offer? Or do you need to touch base with other people and license or get permission from them to own them or have that agreement to share? So there are quite a lot of people, and I get asked this question a lot, and it's a very good question. What's the difference between an IP agent and an IP lawyer? So an IP lawyer has gone to law school, wrote the bar exam, is a lawyer. In some cases, those lawyers have also written the IP agent exam to be a trademark agent and are very knowledgeable about trademarks and trademark law and how trademarks work and how you get one and what you need to know about. But you don't have to be a lawyer to write that exam to be a trademark agent or a patent agent. And if you're trying to get a patent, usually the first step is to get a patent search done. And one of the pieces of advice I often give to my startup entrepreneurs is if you need a patent search, you can hire a patent agent, and you don't need them to have that law degree to do a search. So they might be a little bit cheaper. Eventually, you may want to work with an IP lawyer, and if you need to sue somebody for damages, then you need those legal skills, of course. But there are different skill sets, and knowing what specialty everybody has can be helpful, and there are sometimes ways to stagger your costs. There are also law firms that have package deals for startup companies, especially if you're associated with any of the incubators or the incubation programs to help startups to build and grow. There are often payment plans and different ways you can work with professionals to make it affordable and doable. An IP advisor tends to be more someone like myself. I'm actually not officially an agent. I don't qualify to write the exam to be a trademark agent or a patent agent. But I can still give you education, and we can brainstorm about, well, okay, how does the system work? And what are the tools I might consider using, and how and when would I use them, and what do they protect? So the analogy I use is I can't give you legal advice. And at the end of the day, it's a business decision, and you have to decide what's right for you. But just like you can show up at a lawyer's office needing a will and pay them to sit and coach you through, well, do you own a house? Do you own a car? What are your debts? Do you have kids? All sorts of factors around that. If you're starting from zero, it's kind of expensive at that hourly fee to have them walk you through. If you have the time and the energy to spend, you can do a bit of research yourself online. You can become knowledgeable about, well, what goes into a will or what goes into my IP strategy. And you can show up with a draft and very specific questions. And then maybe you only need 1 or 2 hours of that expert's time, as opposed to 4 hours if you started from scratch. So don't hesitate to reach out to either me if you're in Atlantic Canada, or my equivalents, and later on there'll be a slide showing where we are, and other professionals, and do a little bit of education you're ahead of time. And you've already taken the first step towards that. You're attending this webinar to learn more, to understand a little bit more about how does this work. So good for you. Yay. I'll take a quick pause here just to check in and see, have we had any questions come in?
We just have one question, but it's a good one, I think, which is, can IP be registered to a business rather than a person? What if you own a business? Is it the business IP or is it for an individual?
Great question. Yeah. Normally it would be the business that would own the IP, and that's normally what we recommend because it's a business asset. 50 years ago, a company's assets would be things like maybe an office building or a warehouse or a company vehicle, things like that. But nowadays, a lot of companies, what your assets are as a company is the IP, is the fact that the company owns 1, 2, 3 trademarks. Maybe you've trademarked the name, you've trademarked a logo, you've trademarked a tagline or a slogan. So the short answer is company for sure. If you haven't registered your company yet, that doesn't mean if you come up with a great idea for a slogan or a name and you want to protect it quickly, you can, as an individual, sign up for it and later on pay to transfer it to then belong to your company later. But you need to have what we call honorable intent. There's a 2 years of use it or lose it, so to speak, for trademarks. So if you're planning to launch something in the next couple of years and you just really want to make sure nobody takes it from you before you get there, you can still register it as an individual and later on pay to transfer it. So great question. So there is no one size fits all strategy or model. And again, that's probably one of the main reasons why I do one-on-ones with entrepreneurs and small to growing companies, to say, okay, you've got some IP, some intellectual property, hopefully, that you have registered, but now what? Do you really want to do everything yourself? If you've created an invention and a product that you want to sell, do you want to manufacture it? Do you want to be running a store? What about distribution? All of this type of thing. So then you need to start looking at what's your business model for going forward and what's your ultimate goal. So once you've protected your IP, then you can start assessing what are the different models on how you want to share with other people or collaborate with others to do some or all of the work, whether that's through a licensing agreement, a franchise, or outright selling it. To give you an example, in university settings, lots of times a faculty member, a professor in their research lab or maybe out in the field comes up with something that has commercial value, but they don't want to quit their job as a professor, or maybe you've invented something and you already have another day job and you don't want to quit your day job, but you'd love this to get ahead. Well, maybe then you sell it outright and assign it to somebody else and let them run with it. So there's all kinds of different models. And there are, again, many resources, whether Innovation Canada that offers funding and advice for how to do these kind of collaborations, Business Development Bank, and they have templates for business planning, Export Development Canada. So if you want to export, maybe you're a little further ahead on your path, but now you're looking at, hey, I've done well in Canada or in the province where I live, but now I've got an opportunity to start selling something to the US. Uh-oh, now what? What does that mean for my IP? What does that mean for my business? Now what do I need to do? And the Trade Commissioner's Service is also an excellent resource when you want to go beyond Canada. And they have all kinds of folks with great skill sets and information and resources that can help you. So I think I mentioned previously, when you partner, and I really do use the prenup agreement idea, that what's the background IP? Background IP is I'm coming into this relationship, and what do I already have and own? It can be know-how, or maybe I already even have a patent, an industrial design, I have copyright, I have some forms of IP already. And then there's going to be new foreground IP. We're going to develop things together. And so bringing all of this together and how you're going to make sure that that's clear, what happens to it, it's really important to work with a professional and write everything down. And that way it's clear who owns what was mine before I came into this partnership might stay as mine and mine exclusively. What we develop together has certain terms and conditions, and what happens when we split up, and maybe when we stop collaborating together or things change. So licensing is essentially granting somebody permission to use your IP rights. So once I own it, I can control who gets to use it, how, when, where, for how long. Maybe, we license so that I don't want to sell on the West Coast because I'm based in the East Coast, but I'd love my products to be available there. Well, is it going to be all of my products? And it's going to be maybe the West Coast. For how long? Well, maybe the initial contract is going to say, you know what, you've already got distribution channels and you've got a different set of clients or established clients that you could sell my product to. So that's great. I'm going to focus on Atlantic Canada, but I'm going to go into this licensing agreement so that you sell for BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. And let's start off the relationship, because we're going to see how it goes, for 2 years. And then we'll reassess the contract then. And maybe there's terms as to how that renewal might go. So all of these things are actually negotiable. And then the question is going to be, are you going to pay me a royalty, or am I going to pay you? Is it an upfront fee? Is it ongoing? All of these things are negotiable, and the contract needs to spell all of that out. And so you can look online to see what do people put in contracts, but please do not do just a copy paste and sign it and not have a lawyer work with it. Contract law is incredibly complicated. It is very specific to provinces, and obviously for all of Canada, maybe in some cases, but it's expertise. And this is not a do-it-yourself option. And if you are about to sign a contract, please make sure you've read it and understand what are the implications. So this is where it is really important to be aware of what are the terms and conditions that you are agreeing to. So that's if you're going to collaborate. Coming back to my earlier example, though, what if you don't actually want to be as involved? Well, you might actually assign it to somebody else and let them run with it. It's like, you know what, I've invented it, and there are different ways to assign. And again, you need to work that out. It's normally with an assignment, it's permanent transfer, sale outright, though you may retain certain rights. So again, coming back to my university example, because this is somewhere we see this, if I want to be training graduate students or continuing to research in this area in my lab or out in the field, I may want to retain certain rights for teaching, for research, but let somebody else develop the commercial aspect of the product and run with it that way. Maybe I came up with something for agriculture, for example, and I want farmers to be able to have access to that. But I want, as I said, my students, my research program to be allowed to continue. So it's pretty important to have an idea of who is it you're dealing with and to do your due diligence. If any of you have watched Dragon's Den, you've heard them mention that on the show, right? It works both ways. when somebody's going to invest in your company, they want to do due diligence. They want to make sure you own and you're free and clear on intellectual property, to make sure there's no barriers to investing in you as you go ahead and as you build and grow. At the same time, you want to maybe do some due diligence on somebody who's investing in you or somebody you're going to partner with. What is it that they're bringing to the table? How does your IP fit in with what they're doing? How critical is your IP to the success of their product? If they've collaborated with other people in the past, how did that go? Did they buy them outright? Did it end badly? Was there a lawsuit? And that can happen, right? And what was the nature of that? So once you've owned that and you've built a business or a product and a reputation, you want to kind of tread carefully to make sure you're making good business decisions that are going to be to your benefit as well as to the benefit of your partner. And it's a win-win for both of you. So, as I'm sure you're aware, more so than I certainly would be, it takes quite a broad skill set to get something to the market. You may have created or invented something, but that's only part of the battle. So it's really important to look at all the different skills. And it's not just about the IP. I keep saying there's business decisions as well that are tied to all of those steps. So you need to create a coherent picture of what are your objectives with the business. And then I tend to put on the IP lens or glasses to look at it and say, well, I want to start selling in Canada and the US. Okay, what are the IP implications of that? Well, I need to protect my IP in Canada, but if I'm going to sell to the US, I need to be aware that I also need to protect my IP in the US then. And that's a common first step with many of the entrepreneurs I work with, is we look at where are your potential markets? What are your plans in the longer term? And how do you tap into the various people who can help you and map it out? So really one of the best pieces of advice is you break it into manageable chunks. You have discussions with people who are knowledgeable in the different areas and get them to help you break it down into manageable chunks. So I certainly do that on the IP side when I have discussions with startups and entrepreneurs to say, okay, if your product can be reverse engineered, then I think you're really at a stage you need to be considering patents. And therefore, first step, you need to do a patent search. You need to be aware that you're not infringing on somebody else's IP. Remember, first question, is the coast clear? So that's one of the things that I certainly do, and other people who work with entrepreneurs can be really helpful to break it down into steps with you. And, as an entrepreneur, you probably don't have a huge team. Often the team is one. So you need to wear a lot of hats. As you grow, some of these things will get delegated to different people as your company grows or as your collaborations grow. Then you can do a divide and conquer approach. So in summary, there are all different considerations. You need to first look at, can you take your idea out to the marketplace? Does somebody already have intellectual property that's going to be a barrier to you? If not, how do you then protect what's distinctive to you to make sure people aren't copying you once you launch? What's the market potential? Nailing down your IP rights in a staggered approach. You don't have to protect everything from the very get-go, but some things are time sensitive. How are you going to get to the market? How are you going to get your product or service into the hands of the consumer? And does that involve partnering and working with other people? And what kinds of people, when, etc. And then what are the skill sets and the tasks that need to be done, and how do you tap in to that expertise? So usually one of the first steps is to have a chat with, there are 6 of us across the country who can have those discussions with you to say, okay, tell me about what it is you're working on. Have you got any IP yet? Or, what types of IP do you think you have? And let's work through what are the different tools that might be useful to you and how and when you might use them, and stagger it out. And then get you ready to work with one of the professionals to continue down that path. We also have a 1-800 number with the Client Service Center. They're incredibly helpful. They know how to tap into us as IP advisors, though we are on the CIPO website. But they're also a great resource if you've got some questions, you're looking for information about intellectual property. So they're a great resource. And we work a lot with Innovation Canada, NRC, IRAP. For me here in Atlantic Canada, I work with ACOA, but there's, I believe it's Western Economic Development. Most provinces have business and entrepreneurship resources. So really one of the big key messages is don't be afraid to ask for who can help me with this. And most of us are quite knowledgeable about how to point you in the right direction. There's a whole ecosystem and a team that is more than willing to help. And we really want to see you succeed. So obviously, if there's something we can do to make that happen, it's wonderful to be able to help someone along and give them that lift or that boost to get to the next step. So thank you very much. We've got some time left for questions, and I welcome any additional questions that might have come in or that you might have as a result of today's presentation.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I always learn a lot in these sessions. I see that we have a pretty good mix in attendance today of both entrepreneurs as well as advisors and representatives from entrepreneurial support organizations. And I wonder, based on sort of the Mentimeter, where people were, I think probably from an advisor perspective, looking for a couple quick sort of almost like a checklist, like how do I know when this is something that should talk with an entrepreneur client that I have about? What are some key things I need to get across to them before I send them sort of down a road investigating?
Well, I would say the way I work with my my partners here in Atlantic Canada is the minute the question of IP comes up, they get referred to me, and I book a one-on-one for an hour. Most of the time we end up using the full hour, and the earlier the better. The minute you're even picking a name for your company, did you check the trademark database? Well, if you didn't know to check the trademark database, and that's fine, because how would you know if you haven't gone to a workshop or you haven't attended a session, or maybe you don't remember where to look that up? Then that's when I get the email, that's when I get the referral, and then we start looking at that. And then the next question is, okay, well, what is it you're working on? Tell me about your business. Are you selling clothing? Are you, did you come up with an app? And then we peel back, layer by layer to say, what are the different tools you can use? The minute your company is more than one person, have you got that agreement? Have you got that prenup as to who owns what? How are things going to roll out? All of those types of things. So my key message is it's never too early to start, and it's something you revisit. I have lots of clients that I don't have one meeting with them and then I never hear from them again. Now, it might be a year from now or 2 years from now, and that's fine. but it's a process, and they just kind of check in at various points in that process.
I know there are also quite a few, this has been sort of a topic lately about people who are taking over a business either from their parents, or they're inheriting a business. At what point, or how do they go back and check that all of these things have been done? What does that process look like?
Well, back in the day, we used to talk about paperwork because there were actual physical files. Now some of it's going to be more digital, but it's being aware and asking those questions. When you take over that business, that is part of the due diligence and the questions you ask to say, well, has a trademark been registered? And if you don't know, or nobody knows, again, the Canadian Intellectual Property Office has a database online. Everybody has access to it. Plug in the names. You can plug in a company name to see what trademarks does a company own, or you can type in the words for the actual trademark per se, if it's a word mark, right? So you can use the databases to do searches to see what is there.
I think it's very reassuring. So I'm so echoey. It's very reassuring because advisors do so many jobs that this is one that they don't have to be the expert on. They just need to know where to send people to get the correct information.
Well, I can tell you that for me in Atlantic Canada, and I can't speak to my other colleagues across the country because sometimes there are bandwidth issues, so to speak. But the minute, an NRCI wrap person is working with a client, or Innovation Canada, or for us, it's a COA, or Opportunities New Brunswick, or Nova Scotia Business Inc., or, Innovate PEI, the minute they're working with a client and they haven't talked about IP, or IP comes up and they'll mention, it's like, okay, you need to go talk to Catherine. I'm going to refer you. Just in the last 3 days, I've had a trade commissioner, a COA, NRC IRAP, and Opportunities New Brunswick. All 4 of those organizations referred clients to me.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
And so I believe that Lisa has shared a lot of the places to go if you didn't catch that screen that Catherine shared, but we are also going to have a recording of this that will be sent out to everybody who was in attendance, and will also be on the weoc.ca website, so you can refer back to, and all the links will be included in that as well. So I don't see any more questions. We have a pretty quiet group, I think. There's a lot of thank yous coming through that hopefully you can see, Catherine.
Yeah.
But thank you again for coming. I find these always an excellent resource for our audience, and always get great feedback. So thank you for taking the time today.
Well, thank you again for inviting me, and don't hesitate to tap into the resources at CIPO and the IP advisors. I like to say, that's my job. That's what I do, is I try to help people understand IP so that they can use the right tool at the right time and grow and succeed. So thanks again.
All right. Thank you for everyone for coming.
Okay. Take care, everyone. Stay safe.